Imagine walking into a massive, candlelit church where the air smells like old incense and something else, something sweet and rotting, that makes your stomach flip. The music is playing a slow, bone-chilling song, and every single duke, duchess, and knight in the kingdom is standing perfectly still, their faces pale with pure terror. At the front of the room, sitting on a golden throne, is a woman dressed in the most expensive silks and sparkling jewels you've ever seen. A heavy gold crown is resting on her head, but there is something horribly wrong. Her skin isn't skin at all. It's grey, papery, and stretched over a skull. Her eyes are gone, leaving only dark, empty holes staring out at the crowd. This isn't a movie or a nightmare, this is a real wedding for a ghost. The king stands beside her, his hand resting on her cold, bony shoulder, and he demands that every person in the room walk up, kneel, and kiss her decaying hand to show her respect. If they refuse, they die. But how did a beautiful love story turn into a scene from a horror movie? Why would a king dig up his own wife 2 years after she was buried? And what kind of person would force an entire country to worship a skeleton? This is the story of a man who loved someone so much that even death could unstop him from getting his revenge, and it starts with a fountain of blood and ends with a crown placed on a corpse. By the time we're done, you'll have to ask yourself, was this king the most romantic man to ever live, or had he completely lost his mind? Deep in the heart of Portugal, behind the heavy stone walls of an ancient monastery, lies a secret so dark it feels like it was written for a horror movie, but every word of it is true. We often hear stories about happily ever after, but what happens when ever after is cut short by a sharpened blade and a father's betrayal? This isn't just a history lesson. It is a journey into the mind of a man who was pushed past the breaking point of human sanity. Imagine a love so intense that it didn't end at the grave, but instead dragged the dead back into the light of day. We are about to uncover the life of Prince Pedro, a man who watched the love of his life be torn away from him in a pool of blood, and who spent every second afterward plotting a vengeance so cold and so creative that it still makes people shiver 700 years later. As we peel back the layers of this tragedy, you'll see the moment a heartbroken prince transformed into a terrifying king. A man who didn't just want his enemies dead, he wanted to break their souls. You are going to witness the most stomach-churning ceremony ever recorded in the royal archives, a coronation where the guest of honor was a skeleton. Stay tuned, because you're about to find out how far one man was willing to go to prove that even the grave could unstop him from making his lady a queen, and why the Fountain of Tears still cries for them today. This is the story of the king who turned a funeral into a wedding. And trust me, the ending is something you will never be able to unseen. Long before the crowns and the skeletons, there was a forbidden spark that would eventually set all of Portugal on fire. Prince Pedro was a man trapped in a golden cage, forced into a boring political marriage with a princess named Constanza. But while Constanza held the title, a woman named Inês de Castro held his heart. Inés was a lady-in-waiting, a Spanish noblewoman with hair like spun silk and eyes that seemed to hold all the secrets of the world. Their love was a quiet explosion. They met in hidden gardens and whispered promises in the shadows of the palace, thinking their secret was safe. But in the 14th century, love was a dangerous weapon. Pedro's father, King Afonso, watched from his throne with eyes like flint. To the king, Inés wasn't a person, she was a virus. He feared her powerful Spanish family would use her to take over Portugal, and he feared his son was becoming too weak to lead it. Every time Pedro kissed Inés, his father tightened his grip on his sword. When Pedro's legal wife died, the king expected his son to move on. But Pedro did the opposite. He moved Inés into a beautiful estate in Coimbra and treated her as the true queen of his heart. They lived in a dream for a few years, raising children and walking by a peaceful spring called the Monastery of Santa Clara. But while they were playing house, a death warrant was being signed in the capital. The air in Coimbra grew heavy on that fateful day in January 1355. Pedro was away on a hunting trip, leaving the estate quiet and vulnerable. Inés was sitting by the fountain with her small children, the water bubbling softly, when the sound of heavy boots shattered the peace. Three of the king's most trusted and coldest advisers stepped out of the shadows. They didn't come to talk. They came with steel. Inés looked up, her heart dropping into her stomach as she saw the glint of daggers in the sunlight. She knew immediately why they were there. She fell to her knees, clutching her children to her chest, begging for mercy not for herself, but for the little princes who shared the king's own blood. For a second, the world went silent. It is said that the assassins hesitated, moved by her tears, but the king's shadow was longer than their pity. With a cold nod, the blades were drawn. In a flash of silver and a spray of crimson, the peaceful garden became a slaughterhouse. The Fountain of Tears wasn't just a name. Anymore it became the place where Inés's life poured into the stones. The assassins fled into the woods, leaving her cold and broken on the ground. They thought they had solved a political problem, but they had actually done something much worse. They had killed the only thing keeping the monster inside Prince Pedro asleep. When the prince returned to find his world painted in red, the man he used to be died right there next to her. When the news of Inés's murder reached Pedro, something inside his soul didn't just break, it snapped like a dry bone. He didn't fall to his knees and sob. Instead, a terrifying icy silence took over his body. His eyes, once filled with warmth for his children, turned into two pits of black fire. The prince who loved poetry and music was gone, and in his place stood a warlord who wanted to see the world burn. He gathered his armor, sharpened his sword until it could slice through silk in the air, and turned his back on his father's palace. He didn't care that he was fighting his own blood. He didn't care about the laws of the kingdom. To Pedro, his father, King Afonso, was no longer a king, he was a murderer who had stolen the sun from the sky. Pedro raised a massive army of rebels and moved through the country like a natural disaster. He wasn't just fighting a war, he was hunting. He targeted the lands belonging to the men who had suggested the murder, turning their beautiful estates into piles of ash and charcoal. Imagine the terror of the villagers as they saw Pedro's banners on the horizon, knowing that the prince wasn't there to conquer, but to destroy. He laid waste to the northern provinces, burning crops and tearing down walls, his heart screaming for the blood of the 3 assassins. The air in Portugal was thick with the smell of smoke and the sound of iron clashing against iron. King Afonso watched from his high stone tower, realizing too late that by killing the woman his son loved, he had created a monster that might actually take his crown by force. The war between father and son was brutal and messy, tearing the country apart for months. Every time the king's army tried to push Pedro back, they found a man who fought like he had nothing left to lose because he didn't. He was a shadow of vengeance. Sleeping in the dirt and living only for the moment he could wrap his hands around the throats of the men who took Inês away. The people of Portugal were caught in the middle of a nightmare, watching a son hunt his father through the mountains and valleys. Eventually, the Queen, Pedro's mother, had to rush onto the battlefield, begging her son to stop before there was nothing left of the kingdom to rule. Pedro finally agreed to a shaky peace, but as he stared at his father across the negotiation table, he didn't see a king. He saw a man who was going to die soon, and Pedro was willing to wait. He knew that the throne would eventually be his, and when that crown touched his head, his true revenge would finally begin. The war of swords was over, but the war of the soul was just getting started. The wait for vengeance finally ended with a funeral bell. When King Afonso breathed his last breath, the crown was placed on Pedro's head, but he didn't feel like a king, he felt like a judge. The very first thing he did wasn't to lower taxes or build bridges. It was to hunt. 2 of the 3 assassins, Pero Coelho and Álvaro Goncalves, had fled across the border into the neighboring kingdom of Castile, thinking they were safe behind foreign walls. They thought the new king would be too busy with royal parties to remember a girl murdered years ago. They were dead wrong. Pedro traded high-value prisoners with the King of Castile just to get his hands on them. He didn't want gold. He wanted the men who had heard Inês beg for her life and felt nothing. When the 2 men were finally brought before him in chains, Pedro didn't throw them in a dark dungeon. Instead, he ordered a magnificent banquet to be prepared. The room was filled with the smell of roasted meats and expensive wine, but the atmosphere was as cold as a grave. Pedro sat at the head of the table, staring at the 2 trembling men while he calmly cut his food. He told them that since they had ripped the heart out of his life by killing Inês, it was only fair that he return the favor. This wasn't going to be a quick execution. It was going to be a masterpiece of cruelty. While the king continued to eat his dinner, he ordered the executioners to step forward. In one of the most stomach-turning moments in history, Pedro watched with wide, unblinking eyes as the executioners cut into the men's chests. He didn't just want them dead, he wanted to see the very organs that kept them alive. With the men still screaming, the executioners reached inside and literally ripped their hearts out, one from the front of the chest and one through the back. Legend says that Pedro was so consumed by a dark, hungry rage that he actually bit into the hearts himself. A terrifying symbolic act to swallow the pain they had caused him. The court officials watched in absolute silence, paralyzed by fear, realizing that their new king was unjust Pedro the Just. He was a man who had left his humanity in the fountain of tears. The assassins were gone, their bodies thrown away like trash, but even this bloodbath wasn't enough to satisfy Pedro. The men who killed her were dead, but the woman he loved was still in the ground, and in Pedro's twisted mind, it was time for her to come home. The hearts of the assassins were cold, but Pedro's heart was still screaming. He had killed the men who took her, but the silence of his empty palace was louder than their screams ever were. He realized that being a king meant nothing if he didn't have his queen by his side. It was then that Pedro made an announcement that sent a shiver through the entire country. He claimed that, years ago, in a secret ceremony, he and Inês had actually been married. This meant she wasn't just his girlfriend. She was the rightful Queen of Portugal, and Pedro decided it was time for her to take her throne. He gave a command that sounded like a line from a ghost story: dig her up. The monks at the monastery of Santa Clara Velha were horrified. Inês had been in the ground for 2 long years. They tried to tell the king that nature had already taken its course, that there was nothing left but bones and shadows. But Pedro wouldn't listen. Under the flickering light of torches in the middle of the night, soldiers plunged their shovels into the earth. The sound of metal hitting the wooden coffin echoed like a heartbeat through the silent graveyard. When the lid was finally creaked open, the smell of the damp earth mixed with the scent of decay. Most men would have turned away in horror, but when Pedro looked down into that coffin, he didn't see a skeleton. He saw his beautiful infant. He reached down with trembling hands and lifted her remains out of the dirt as if she were only sleeping. He brought her back to the palace in a grand procession, but this wasn't a funeral, March, it was a homecoming. He ordered the royal dressmakers to bring out the finest white silk and the most delicate lace. He sent for the crown jewelers to bring a headpiece sparkling with diamonds and rubies. In the quiet of the royal chambers, the king's servants were forced to perform a task that must have felt like a nightmare. They had to dress the decaying remains of Inês de Castro in royal robes. They draped the expensive fabric over her bony frame and used golden wire to keep her upright. Pedro sat by her side the whole time, whispering to her, combing what was left of her hair, and telling her that she was finally going to get the respect she deserved. The palace was being decorated for a wedding, but the bride was a ghost, and the king was the only one who didn't see the horror of it. The stage was set for the most terrifying party in history. The doors to the great cathedral swung open, but instead of the smell of flowers, a thick, heavy scent of perfume and decay drifted out into the night. Inside, thousands of candles flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the stone walls. The entire nobility of Portugal, the powerful dukes, the proud knights, and the elegant ladies stood in 2 perfect lines, their bodies stiff and their breath shallow. They were terrified. At the end of the long aisle, sitting high on a golden throne, was the nightmare they had all heard whispers about. Inês de Castro was back. She sat perfectly still, dressed in shimmering robes of silver and gold that sparkled under the candlelight. A heavy crown sat atop her skull, tilted slightly, and her face was covered by a thin, silken veil that fluttered whenever a cold breeze swept through the room. Beside her stood King Pedro, his hand resting firmly on the arm of her throne, his eyes daring anyone to look away. Then came the command that no one would ever forget. Pedro declared that because Inês was now officially the queen, every single noble in the room had to pay her homage as if she was still breathing. One by one, the most powerful people in the country had to walk up the steps of the throne. You could hear the faint clinking of their armor and the rustle of their clothes in the dead silence. But as each person reached the front, they had to kneel before the seated corpse. With trembling hands and stomachs turning in knots, they were forced to reach out, take the cold, bony grey hand of the dead queen, and press their lips to it in a kiss of loyalty. It was the ultimate psychological revenge. Pedro watched every single person with a gaze like a hawk. He knew which of these men had cheered when she was killed. He knew who had whispered lies about her to his father. Now he was forcing them to touch the very thing they had tried to destroy. The ceremony went on for hours. The air grew colder, and the silence grew heavier as man after man knelt before the ghost on the throne. To Pedro, this wasn't an act of madness. It was an act of pure, unadulterated justice. He was showing the world that even death was not powerful enough to take away the crown he had promised her. He was making his enemies bow to her, making them acknowledge her power when she could no longer speak for herself. It was the most macabre wedding the world had ever seen, a union of the living and the dead. By the time the last noble had kissed her hand, the message was clear. Pedro was the king, Inês was the queen, and anyone who ever dared to touch what he loved would face a vengeance that lasted long after the heart stopped beating. The coronation was over, and the legend of the Corpse Queen was carved into history forever. After the terrifying coronation was over, Pedro knew he couldn't keep Inês on a throne forever. He had proven his point and broken the spirit of his enemies. So he decided to give her the most magnificent resting place the world had ever seen. He didn't just build a grave. He built a masterpiece in the monastery of Alcobaça. He commissioned 2 giant, white marble tombs covered in the most detailed carvings of angels and stars. But the most important part wasn't the gold or the marble, it was where he put them. Most royal couples are buried side by side, but Pedro gave a very specific, very strange order. He wanted his tomb placed directly facing hers, foot to foot. He believed that when the world finally ended and the dead rose from their graves, the very first thing he would see when he opened his eyes would be her face. He wanted to make sure that even in the afterlife, they wouldn't have to search for each other for even a second. The story of Pedro and Inês is one that stays with you long after the candles have blown out. It's a story that asks us, how far is too far? Was Pedro a romantic hero who refused to let death win? Or was he a man who let his grief turn him into something unrecognizable? Today, if you visit that monastery in Portugal, you can still see those two beautiful tombs sitting in the quiet shadows, waiting for the end of time. The blood at the Fountain of Tears may have dried centuries ago, and the crown may have been returned to the treasury, but the legend of the king who crowned a corpse lives on. It serves as a haunting reminder that while kings can be killed and kingdoms can fall, a love fueled by revenge is something that even the grave cannot hide. So, the next time you think a love story is just about flowers and poems, remember Pedro the King, who proved that true love can be the most terrifying thing on earth.